The summer sun hung low over Whispering Creek, casting long shadows across the dusty Main Street as Katherine Turner stepped off the stagecoach, her entire life packed in two worn leather suitcases. The townsfolk stopped their business to stare at the newcomer, a slender young woman with copper hair and eyes that told stories her lips never would. The weight of their curious glances fell heavy on her shoulders, but Katherine kept her gaze fixed on the wooden boardwalk beneath her feet, knowing that the moment someone addressed her, everything would change. Katherine's arrival in Whispering Creek was born of necessity rather than choice. At 22, she had lost her parents to influenza back east, leaving her with nothing but a letter from her Aunt Martha, who had settled in this frontier town years ago. The letter promised a home and perhaps work in her aunt's small general store. What it hadn't mentioned was that her aunt had passed 3 months prior, leaving Katherine entirely alone in a strange town. Sheriff James Miller, a portly man with a gray-streaked mustache, was the first to approach her. "Miss, you look a mite lost. Can I help you find your way?" Katherine looked up, her mouth opening slightly before closing again. Her throat tightened as it always did when strangers addressed her. She fumbled in her pocket, pulling out a small notepad and pencil, quickly scribbling her aunt's name and address before handing it to the sheriff. The sheriff's brow furrowed as he read the note. Martha Turner. His expression softened with recognition, then fell. "Oh, I'm sorry to tell you this, miss, but Martha passed some time back. Pneumonia took her quick like." Katherine's face drained of color. She reached for her notepad again, writing with trembling hands, "I am Katherine Turner, her niece. I've come to live with her." As the sheriff explained the situation to the gathering crowd, whispers began to circulate. "She don't talk," one woman murmured. "Strange girl," another commented, not bothering to lower her voice. "Well, Miss Turner," the sheriff said kindly, trying to ignore the murmurs around them, "your aunt's store was sold to cover her debts, but her house is still there. Town council's been maintaining it till next of kin could be contacted. Guess that'd be you." Katherine nodded gratefully, though her eyes betrayed her panic. No aunt, no job, just a house in a town where she was already being labeled as strange. "I'll show you the way," the sheriff offered, but before he could take her bags, a harsh laugh cut through the murmuring crowd. "Got ourselves a mute, do we?" A short, stocky man with a face pockmarked from smallpox stepped forward. "Hope you ain't planning to open that store again. Town's got no use for a shopkeeper who can't even call out prices." The crowd's uncomfortable laughter stung Katherine's ears. She clutched her notepad tighter, stepping back as if physically struck. "That's enough, Daniels," the sheriff warned, but the damage was done. Katherine could feel every eye on her, judging, wondering, pitying. From the edge of the crowd, a tall figure stepped forward. His movements had the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin, despite the trail dust covering his dark blue shirt and worn denim pants. The late afternoon sun glinted off the silver spurs on his boots and the star-shaped badge pinned to his leather vest. "Seems to me," the man said, his voice quiet yet somehow filling the space between buildings, "that folks ought to be judged by their character, not their voices." He tipped his hat to Katherine, revealing eyes the color of sun-warmed whiskey. "Blake Thornton, Deputy Marshal, just rode in myself. Sheriff, I'd be obliged if you'd point me toward the telegraph office after seeing the lady to her destination." Something about his calm, unruffled demeanor silenced the crowd more effectively than the sheriff's warnings. Perhaps it was the casual way his hand rested near the holstered Colt at his hip, or maybe it was simply the quiet authority he projected. Katherine found herself studying his face strong-jawed with a 2-day stubble, sun-weathered but not unkind. He couldn't have been more than 30, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of miles traveled and things seen that added years to his soul. The sheriff nodded with apparent relief. "Marshal Thornton's right. Show some Christian charity, folks. Miss Turner's just lost her last kin." He turned to Katherine. "Let's get you settled, miss." As the crowd dispersed, Deputy Marshal Thornton picked up her larger suitcase before she could protest. "I'm headed that way anyhow," he said simply, not waiting for a response she couldn't give. Catherine followed the two men down the dusty street, acutely aware of the curious glances from storefront windows and passing townsfolk. Whispering Creek wasn't large, perhaps 40 buildings arranged along a main street with a few side roads branching off toward scattered homesteads. The painted sign announcing Whispering Creek, Pop. 427 at the town entrance seemed optimistic rather than accurate. Her aunt's house turned out to be a modest white clapboard structure at the edge of town, small but neat with a porch that wrapped around the front and a maple tree offering shade in the yard. The sheriff produced a key, explaining apologetically that some of the furniture had been sold, but the basics remained. Town council will want to speak with you about the property, he added as they stepped inside. But that can wait till you're settled. The interior was simple: a front parlor with a faded sofa and rocking chair, a kitchen with an iron stove, and two small bedrooms in the back. It smelled of dust and emptiness, but underneath was a faint trace of lavender that made Catherine's heart ache with memories of her mother. "It's not much," Sheriff Miller said, "but it's solid, no leaks, good stove." Catherine nodded, setting down her smaller case and taking out her notepad. "Thank you for your kindness." "No trouble at all," the sheriff replied. "I'll leave you to get settled. Come by my office tomorrow and we'll sort out the paperwork." As the sheriff turned to leave, Deputy Marshal Thornton lingered. "Miss Turner," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "folks here aren't bad people, just set in their ways. They'll warm up once they know you." Catherine looked at him skeptically but appreciated the sentiment. She wrote quickly, "You're not from here either." He shook his head. "Just passing through on business, tracking a gang that's been hitting banks up north." He paused, studying her face. "Will you be all right here alone?" Catherine straightened her shoulders and nodded firmly. She'd been alone since her parents died. This was no different. "There's a widow, Mrs. Chen, runs a laundry 2 doors down," he continued. "Good woman, might be worth introducing yourself." Catherine wrote, "Thank you for the suggestion. And for carrying my bag." A slight smile crossed his face, transforming his serious expression. "My pleasure, Miss Turner." He tipped his hat again and turned to leave, pausing at the door. "I'll likely see you around town." After he left, Catherine sat on the edge of the sofa, suddenly overwhelmed by the silence of the empty house and the enormity of her situation. She had enough money to last perhaps 2 months if she was careful. After that, she pushed the thought away, focusing instead on unpacking her belongings and making the house livable. By nightfall, she had swept the floors, dusted the furniture, and made up the smaller bedroom with her own linens. She fell asleep that night to the unfamiliar sounds of a frontier town, distant piano music from the saloon, the occasional whinny of horses, and the wind whispering through the maple tree outside her window. The next morning, Catherine dressed carefully in her best navy skirt and white blouse, determined to make a proper impression on the town council. She had just finished pinning her hair when a knock at the door startled her. Opening it, she found herself face to face with Deputy Marshal Blake Thornton, looking more rested than the previous day but no less imposing. "Morning, Miss Turner," he said, hat in hand. "Hope I'm not disturbing you." Catherine shook her head, gesturing for him to enter. "I won't keep you," he said, remaining on the porch. "Just wanted to check that you settled in all right and to give you this." He held out a small basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Mrs. Chen's doing. Heard we had a newcomer and insisted I deliver it." Catherine accepted the basket, lifting the cloth to find fresh biscuits and a jar of preserves. The unexpected kindness brought a lump to her throat. She nodded her thanks, wishing not for the first time that words would come easily to her. "I mentioned you might be looking for work," Blake continued. "Mrs. Chen could use help with the laundry. It's hard work, but honest." Catherine's eyes widened in surprise. She reached for the notepad she now kept in her pocket. "Thank you. I was going to look for work today. Figured as much." "You don't strike me as someone who sits idle." There was that smile again, brief but genuine. "I should let you get on with your day. I've got rounds to make." Catherine impulsively wrote, "Will you be at Mrs. Chen's later?" He nodded. "I take my meals there when I'm in town. Food's better than the saloon and the company's more civilized." He settled his hat back on his head. "Good luck with the town council, Miss Turner." As he walked away, Katherine wondered how he knew about her meeting with the council. Small towns, she supposed everyone knew everyone's business. Her meeting with the town council went much as she expected. 5 stern-faced men, including Sheriff Miller, informed her that her aunt's house was legally hers, but taxes were due within the month. The amount they named made her stomach clench, but she nodded calmly, writing that she understood and would make arrangements. Afterward, she made her way to Mrs. Chen's laundry, a weathered building with steam billowing from its windows and clotheslines stretching across the backyard. The smell of lye soap and starch filled the air. Mrs. Chen herself was a revelation, a tiny woman no taller than Katherine's shoulder, with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and hands roughened by years of hot water and harsh soaps. Unlike most of the townsfolk, she showed no surprise at Katherine's muteness. "My husband not speak English when we come here," she explained in accented but clear English. "People treat him like child, not right." She studied Katherine with shrewd eyes. "You work hard." Katherine nodded vigorously. "Good, I need strong back, quick hands. Start tomorrow, sunrise, 6 days, $1.50 a week." It wasn't much, but it would help. Katherine wrote her acceptance and thanks. "No need for paper with me," Mrs. Chen said, tapping her own chest. "I watch eyes, hands." "I understand." She made a shooing motion. "Go now, rest, tomorrow hard work." Katherine left feeling lighter than she had in days. She had a home, albeit one with looming taxes, and now a job. Perhaps Whispering Creek could become home after all. That tentative optimism was tested the next morning when she arrived at the general store to purchase supplies. The bell above the door announced her entrance, and the shop fell silent as heads turned her way. The proprietor, a thin man with spectacles perched on a prominent nose, watched her approach the counter. "Help you?" he asked, his tone neither friendly nor hostile. Katherine took out her notepad, carefully listing the items she needed: flour, sugar, coffee, and so on. The man squinted at her list. "Strange way to do business," he muttered, but began gathering her items. From behind her, a woman's voice carried clearly. "My Henry says it ain't natural. A grown woman not speaking might be simple in the head." Katherine's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes fixed on the counter. "Or just putting on airs," another voice added. "Too good to talk to common folk." The shopkeeper placed her items on the counter, tallying the cost. As Katherine counted out her money, the bell rang again. "Morning, Marshal," the shopkeeper called, his demeanor instantly more cordial. "Simmons," Blake acknowledged, nodding to the other customers as he approached the counter. He stood beside Katherine, seemingly oblivious to the charged atmosphere. "Miss Turner, settling in." Katherine managed a small nod, painfully aware of the watching eyes. "Got those nails I ordered?" Blake asked the shopkeeper. "Just came in yesterday. £2, wasn't it?" As the shopkeeper turned to retrieve the order, Blake leaned slightly toward Katherine. "Folks just need time," he said quietly. "Don't let them chase you off." The simple acknowledgement of her struggle nearly undid her. She blinked rapidly, focusing on gathering her purchases. Blake paid for his nails, then surprised her by taking the heavier of her packages. "I'm headed back to Mrs. Chen's. Mind if I walk with you?" Outside, the spring morning had warmed considerably, promising a hot afternoon ahead. They walked in companionable silence for a while before Blake spoke. "Been meaning to ask," he said casually, "if you'd care to join me for supper tonight. Mrs. Chen's making her special dumplings." Katherine stopped short, staring at him in confusion. Was the handsome deputy marshal asking to court her? After just one day, seeing her expression, Blake clarified quickly, "Not as I mean just as neighbors. Thought you might appreciate some friendly company." A flush crept up from his collar, making him look younger and less sure of himself. "No obligation, of course." Relieved and oddly disappointed at the same time, Katherine pulled out her notepad. "I would like that, thank you." His smile returned. "Good, around 6 then." That evening marked the beginning of a routine that would sustain Katherine through her first difficult weeks in Whispering Creek. By day, she worked alongside Mrs. Chen, learning the laundry business, how to remove different stains, how hot to heat the irons for various fabrics, how to fold men's shirts just so. The work was indeed hard, leaving her hands red and her back aching, but there was satisfaction in it too. And most evenings, she would join Blake for supper at Mrs. Chen's back table, where the woman served simple but delicious meals to a handful of regular boarders. Blake never pressed her to explain her silence. Instead, he filled the space with stories of his own growing up on a ranch in Texas, joining the Rangers at 19, eventually becoming a deputy U.S. Marshal. He spoke of tracking outlaws across 3 territories, of nights spent under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, of towns springing up overnight around silver strikes and disappearing just as quickly. Katherine found herself looking forward to these suppers more than she cared to admit. Blake's easy acceptance of her muteness was a balm after days of enduring stares and whispers in town. When she wrote responses or questions, he treated her words with the same respect he would spoken ones, never rushing her or finishing her thoughts. 2 weeks after her arrival, Katherine was scrubbing a particularly stubborn stain from a tablecloth when Mrs. Chen approached. "You go to social?" The older woman asked, nodding toward a poster tacked to the wall announcing a town gathering that coming Saturday. Katherine shook her head quickly. The thought of being surrounded by townsfolk who already considered her odd made her stomach clench. "Should go," Mrs. Chen insisted. "How else they know you? Hide here, they think more strange things." Katherine hesitated, then wrote, "They mock me when I cannot speak." Mrs. Chen snorted. "People always mock what they not understand. You go head high. Show them Katherine Turner not afraid," but Katherine was afraid. Since childhood, her silence had marked her as different, someone to be pitied or ridiculed. Her parents had sheltered her as best they could, but they couldn't protect her from the world's cruelty. After their deaths, she'd learned how harsh that world could be to a woman alone, especially one who couldn't speak for herself. That evening at supper, Blake noticed her preoccupation. "Something troubling you?" he asked after they'd eaten, lingering over coffee while Mrs. Chen cleared away dishes. Katherine hesitated, then wrote, "The town social. Mrs. Chen thinks I should go." "She's right," Blake said. "It's a good way to meet folks under better circumstances." Katherine wrote again, "I would be uncomfortable. People stare, they whisper." Blake considered this, his expression thoughtful. "What if you had company? Someone to run interference?" Katherine raised an eyebrow questioningly. "I'm saying I'd be honored to escort you, Miss Turner, if you'd allow it." The offer surprised her. Blake had been friendly, certainly, but this felt different, more formal, more significant. "Why would you do that?" she wrote, then immediately regretted the bluntness of the question, but Blake didn't seem offended. "Because I enjoy your company," he said simply, "and because everyone deserves a fair chance in a new place." Katherine studied his face, looking for signs of pity or, worse, mockery. She found neither, only an open sincerity that made her decision easier than expected. "Thank you. I would appreciate the escort." "Good," he said, and that smile appeared again, the one that transformed his face and made her heart beat a little faster. It's settled then. The town social was held in the newly constructed schoolhouse, a long rectangular building that doubled as a community gathering place. When Katherine arrived on Blake's arm, wearing her best dress, freshly pressed by her own hands, the assembled townsfolk made little effort to hide their surprise. Marshal Thornton and the mute girl, someone whispered loudly enough to carry. "Now there's an odd pairing." Katherine stiffened, but Blake's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, a gentle pressure that somehow conveyed both reassurance and indignation on her behalf. "Miss Turner," he corrected in a voice that carried across the room, "is my guest this evening. I'd consider it a personal favor if she were made to feel welcome." Whether it was respect for his badge or the subtle warning in his tone, the whispers subsided. Blake led her to a table laden with refreshments, introducing her to those nearby with a natural ease that helped smooth the awkwardness of her written responses. Not everyone was receptive. Several women gave her cold looks or spoke over her head as if she weren't present. But others, perhaps taking their cue from Blake, made genuine efforts to include her in conversations. The mayor's wife, Mrs. Hammond, a plump woman with a kind face, proved particularly friendly. My sister's boy was born without hearing, she confided. Folks thought him simple till we figured out he just couldn't hear them. Now he reads lips better than most read books. Katherine smiled gratefully at this understanding, writing, I can hear, but words won't come, since I was a child. The mind works in mysterious ways, Mrs. Hammond said without a trace of judgment. My Edward, that's the mayor, he can recite Shakespeare by heart, but can't remember our anniversary to save his life. She laughed heartily at her own joke. As the evening progressed, musicians set up in one corner a fiddler, a man with a harmonica, and another with a guitar. Soon the center of the room was cleared for dancing. Katherine watched from the sidelines as couples formed up for a lively reel. She had always loved music and dancing, one of the few activities where her lack of speech didn't matter. Her foot tapped unconsciously to the rhythm. Blake, who had stepped away to speak with the sheriff, returned to find her watching the dancers. Care to join them? He asked, extending his hand. Katherine hesitated only briefly before accepting. As Blake led her onto the floor, she was acutely aware of the stairs following them, but once the music swept them up, the rest of the room seemed to fade away. Blake proved to be an excellent dancer, guiding her through the steps with confidence. When the reel ended and a waltz began, he drew her closer, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers. You dance beautifully, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Katherine flushed with pleasure at the compliment. It had been so long since she'd danced, since she'd felt anything approaching normal social interaction. For these few minutes, spinning around the floor in Blake's arms, she was just a woman enjoying an evening out, not the mute girl or that strange Turner woman. As the music ended, Blake escorted her back to the refreshment table for punch. They were joined by Sheriff Miller and his wife, a conversation that might have been awkward but for Blake's natural ability to include Katherine without drawing attention to her written responses. It was nearing 10 o'clock when Blake leaned close to ask if she was ready to leave. Katherine nodded, the excitement of the evening giving way to tiredness. They made their farewells, and she was pleasantly surprised by how many people now addressed her directly, nodding or smiling in acknowledgement. The night air was cool after the warmth of the crowded schoolhouse. Blake offered his arm again for the walk home, their path lit by a nearly full moon and the occasional glow from house windows. You seem to enjoy yourself, Blake observed as they walked. Katherine nodded, then gestured for him to wait while she wrote by moonlight. Thank you for tonight. It meant more than I can say. It was my pleasure, he replied, and there was a warmth in his voice that made her look up sharply. In the silvery light, his expression was difficult to read, but something in his eyes made her breath catch. They reached her porch too quickly. Katherine paused on the top step, turning to face him, suddenly uncertain. The evening had shifted something between them, but she wasn't sure what or how. I should let you rest, Blake said, his hat in his hands. You work early tomorrow. Katherine nodded, but neither moved. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken words. Finally, Blake broke the silence. Good night, Katherine, he said, using her given name for the first time. I'll see you at supper tomorrow. As she watched him walk away, Katherine realized she was smiling. For the first time since arriving in Whispering Creek, she felt as if she might find a place here after all. The next few weeks brought gradual changes to Katherine's life in Whispering Creek. Her work at Mrs. Chen's laundry became easier as she grew accustomed to the routines. The older woman proved to be not just an employer but a mentor, teaching Katherine not only about laundry but about standing firm in a world that often misunderstood both of them. Men think because I small I weak, Mrs. Chen said one afternoon as they folded sheets together. Because I speak with accent I stupid, I let them think, then I charge extra for difficult stains. Her laugh was surprisingly girlish. Same for you. Let them think what they want. You know truth. The truth, as Katherine was coming to understand it, was that her silence didn't define her any more than her red hair or green eyes. It was simply part of who she was, neither good nor bad, just different. Blake's presence in her life continued to be a source of strength and, increasingly, confusion. Their suppers together had become the highlight of her days. He treated her with a respect and consideration she'd rarely experienced outside her family, drawing out her thoughts through her written words and responding to them as if they were engaged in normal conversation. But there were moments, a lingering glance, a brush of hands as they walked, the way his smile seemed reserved just for her that suggested his feelings might run deeper than friendship. Katherine found herself both hoping for and fearing such a development. One evening in late May, about 6 weeks after her arrival, Blake was unusually quiet during supper. Katherine finally wrote, "Something's troubling you." He looked up from his barely touched stew. "Got a telegram today. The gang I've been tracking hit a bank in Silverdale. 2 people killed." Katherine's face fell in sympathy. She'd almost forgotten the reason for Blake's presence in Whispering Creek, that he was hunting dangerous men, that his stay was temporary. "I need to ride out tomorrow," he continued. "Sheriff's organized a posse. We'll meet up with the county marshal near Ridgeline." "How long will you be gone?" she wrote, trying to keep her expression neutral. "Hard to say. A week, maybe longer." He hesitated. "I wanted to ask, would you keep an eye on my room at Mrs. Chen's? Make sure nobody disturbs my things." Katherine nodded, touched by his trust. "And," he added, his voice dropping slightly, "I was hoping you might write to me while I'm gone, just news of town, if you've time." The request surprised her. "You want me to write to you?" "I'd consider it a kindness," he said. "Gets lonely on the trail." Katherine found herself nodding again, warmth spreading through her chest at the thought that he valued her written words enough to want them while he was away. The next morning, Katherine rose before dawn, earlier than necessary even for her work at the laundry. She made her way to the livery stable where the posse was gathering, staying at the edge of the small crowd of onlookers. Blake spotted her immediately, breaking away from his conversation with the sheriff to approach her. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, his expression a mix of surprise and something that looked like pleasure. Katherine handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "What's this?" he asked, untying it carefully. Inside was a folded handkerchief, plain but neatly hemmed, with his initials embroidered in one corner. "For luck," Katherine wrote on her ever-present notepad, "and a reminder to come back safely." Blake looked from the handkerchief to her face, his expression softening. "I'll treasure it," he said quietly, "and I promise to return." A call from the sheriff interrupted the moment. Blake carefully tucked the handkerchief into his shirt pocket close to his heart. "I'll hold you to that letter," he said with a smile, then turned to join the others. Katherine watched them ride out, dust rising from beneath their horses' hooves in the golden light of early morning. Only when they were out of sight did she realize that several townsfolk had observed their exchange with undisguised interest. Well, Mrs. Simmons, the shopkeeper's wife, said loudly enough for Katherine to hear. "Seems the marshal's taken a shine to our mute girl. Wonder what he sees in her." "A pretty face, I reckon," her companion replied. "Can't be the conversation." The cruel laughter followed Katherine as she hurried toward the laundry, her cheeks burning. She'd been foolish to come to make such a public display. Now she'd given the gossips fresh material. Mrs. Chen took one look at her face as she entered and nodded knowingly. "Town women have sharp tongues, sharper than needles," she said. "Jealousy makes them say cruel things." "Jealousy," Katherine wrote, confused, of course. "Young Marshal favors you, not them or their daughters, makes them angry." Mrs. Chen shrugged. "Is their problem, not yours." The idea that anyone might be jealous of her attention from Blake was so foreign that Katherine had trouble processing it. But as the days passed and Blake's absence stretched, she became aware of subtle changes in how some of the townswomen treated her cool looks, whispered comments, the occasional snide remark about getting above herself. She did write to Blake, as promised. Her first letter was hesitant, filled with mundane details about the weather and town happenings. But as she wrote more letters, one every other day, sent to the nearest telegraph office where Blake had arranged to collect them, she found herself opening up, sharing thoughts and feelings she'd never expressed to anyone. She wrote about her childhood in Pennsylvania, about the illness at age 5 that had stolen her voice. She described her parents, her father, a bookkeeper with a passion for poetry, her mother, a seamstress who taught Katherine to embroider and mend. She confessed her fears about making a life in Whispering Creek, her worries about paying the taxes on her aunt's house, her growing fondness for Mrs. Chen and her wisdom. What she didn't write was how much she missed Blake's presence, how the evenings seemed emptier without their shared suppers, how she found herself watching the road into town each day, hoping to see a familiar figure riding in. 10 days after Blake's departure, Katherine was hanging laundry in the yard behind Mrs. Chen's when she heard a commotion from the direction of the main street. Shouts and the sound of horses moving at speed broke the afternoon quiet. Mrs. Chen appeared at the back door. "Go see," she urged Katherine. "Something happening." Katherine hurried through the building and out to the street where a crowd was gathering. The posse was returning, men and horses dusty and tired. Her heart leaped at the sight of Blake among them, apparently unharmed, sitting tall in his saddle despite evident exhaustion. Behind the lawman came 2 additional horses bearing bodies draped over their saddles, dead outlaws, Katherine realized with a shock. And behind them, 3 men with hands bound, riding under guard. She stayed back as the prisoners were taken to the jail and the bodies to the undertakers. Only when Blake had dismounted and handed his horse off to a stable boy did she approach. His face lit up when he saw her. "Katherine," he said, his voice rough with fatigue but warm. "Got your letters, every one of them." Before she could respond, Sheriff Miller clapped him on the shoulder. "Buy you a drink, Marshal, you earned it." Blake shook his head. "Appreciate it, but I'm dead on my feet. Rain check." The sheriff nodded, giving Katherine a knowing look that made her blush. "Tomorrow, then. Got paperwork to fill out anyway." As the crowd dispersed, Blake turned back to Katherine. "Walk with me," he asked, "just to Mrs. Chen's. I need a bath and about 12 hours sleep, but I'd like your company for a few minutes." They walked slowly, Blake limping slightly. When Katherine looked concerned, he explained, "Horse slipped crossing a stream. Nothing serious, just a bruised leg." At Mrs. Chen's back door they paused. Blake looked down at her, his expression suddenly serious. "Your letters, they meant a lot, out there." He gestured vaguely toward the open country beyond town. "Gave me something to look forward to at the end of each day." Katherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. She took out her notepad. "I'm glad you're back safely." "So am I," he said with feeling. "I have a lot to tell you, but it can wait till I'm more fit for company." He hesitated, then added, "Would tomorrow evening be too soon to call on you? At your home, I mean, not for supper at Mrs. Chen's." The implication was clear. He was asking to court her formally. Katherine's heart raced as she wrote, "I would like that very much." His smile was tired but genuine. "Until tomorrow, then." That night, Katherine lay awake long after she should have been sleeping, her mind replaying the day's events. Blake was back, safe and seemingly eager to see her. But what did it mean? Could a man like him, educated, respected, able to go anywhere and do anything, truly be interested in a woman who couldn't speak? Or was it merely kindness, perhaps mixed with loneliness in a strange town? The next evening, Katherine prepared for Blake's visit with nervous energy. She cleaned her already tidy house, arranged wildflowers in a jar on the table, and changed her dress twice before settling on a simple blue cotton that Mrs. Chen had pronounced very becoming when Katherine wore it to church the previous Sunday. Blake arrived precisely at 7, freshly shaved and wearing clean clothes, his usual trail dust nowhere to be seen. He presented her with a small package, a book of poetry by Emily Dickinson. "Noticed you didn't have many books," he explained as she unwrapped it, his expression almost shy. "Thought you might enjoy these. The general store had a surprisingly good selection." Katherine ran her fingers over the embossed cover, deeply touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. She wrote, "It's perfect, thank you." They sat in her small parlor, the windows open to catch the evening breeze. Blake told her about the pursuit of the outlaws, how they'd tracked them to an abandoned mining camp, the brief but violent shootout that had left 2 gang members dead and 3 captured. "They'll stand trial in the territorial court," he concluded. "Good chance they'll hang for the murders in Silverdale," Katherine wrote. "Will you have to testify?" He nodded. "In about a month, but I'll be back." He looked directly at her as he said this, making it clear he was promising more than just a return to Whispering Creek. There was a moment of silence, comfortable rather than awkward. Then Blake leaned forward slightly, his expression growing serious. "Katherine, I need to be honest with you," he began. "My work takes me all over the territory. I'm never in one place for long. It's not an easy life, especially for—" He trailed off. For a woman, she wrote, her stomach tightening with disappointment. Was this his way of letting her down gently? "For anyone I care about," he corrected. "And I do care about you, Katherine, more than I expected to, more than might be wise given my circumstances." Katherine stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. She wrote quickly, "I care for you too." His face softened. "Even knowing I can't offer stability, that I might be called away at any time, sometimes for weeks." Katherine considered this carefully before writing. "I've learned that nothing in life is certain. We can only make the best choices with what we know now." Blake read her words, then looked up with a smile that reached his eyes. "You're a wise woman, Katherine Turner." He reached across the small space between them, taking her hand in his. "I'd like to continue calling on you if you're amenable, see where this leads us." Katherine nodded, a smile spreading across her face that she couldn't have suppressed if she'd tried. "There's something else," Blake added, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "Something I've wanted to ask since I met you but didn't want to pry." Katherine tilted her head questioningly. "Your silence. Is it that you cannot speak or choose not to?" It was a fair question, one she'd been asked before in less considerate ways. She freed her hand to write. The doctor called it hysterical mutism. "After a fever when I was 5, words wouldn't come. As if the connection between my thoughts and my voice was broken." Blake nodded thoughtfully. "And there's no cure?" Katherine shook her head. "Not that any doctor has found. Some say I could speak if I truly wanted to, but that's not true. I've tried. The words are there in my mind, but my throat closes, no sound comes." "I'm sorry," Blake said, and unlike when others said those words, she believed him. "Not because there's anything wrong with you as you are, but because I know it must make life difficult sometimes." "It does," she acknowledged, "but it's part of who I am now. I've adapted." "That you have," he agreed with admiration, "most impressively." The evening passed too quickly after that, filled with conversation that flowed as naturally as if they were both speaking aloud. When Blake finally rose to leave, he asked permission to call on her again the following evening. At the door, he hesitated, then leaned down to press a gentle kiss to her cheek. "Good night, Katherine," he murmured. "Sweet dreams." Katherine touched her cheek after he left, the spot where his lips had brushed her skin still tingling. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she found herself thinking about the future with hope rather than anxiety. Over the next few weeks, Blake called on Katherine almost every evening. Sometimes they walked through town or along the creek that gave Whispering Creek its name. Other times they sat on her porch or in her parlor, sharing the events of their days. Blake brought her more books, novels, poetry, even a manual on photography when she expressed interest in the new art form. Katherine found herself falling in love with this quiet, thoughtful man who saw beyond her silence to the person underneath. Blake never seemed frustrated by her written communications, never finished her thoughts for her, or grew impatient waiting for her to write. He treated her words, whether written or expressed through gestures, with the same respect he would spoken ones. The townsfolk noticed their courtship, of course. Opinions were divided. Some, like Mrs. Chen and Sheriff Miller, seemed genuinely pleased. Others muttered about strange pairings and wondered aloud what Blake saw in the mute girl. One afternoon in late June, Katherine was delivering freshly laundered linens to the hotel when she overheard a conversation that stopped her in her tracks. "Marshal Thornton could have his pick of any girl in the territory," a woman's voice said from around the corner. "It's downright peculiar him choosing that Turner woman." "Maybe he likes that she can't talk back," a man responded with a coarse laugh. "Perfect wife, pretty enough and permanently silent. Still, what kind of life would that be, having to wait while she scribbles every thought on paper? And what about children? How could a mute woman raise proper children?" Katherine backed away silently, her cheeks burning with humiliation and anger. The words echoed what her own doubts had whispered late at night. What kind of future could she and Blake have? Would he eventually tire of her silence, resent the limitations it placed on their communication? That evening when Blake called, he immediately sensed something was wrong. "What is it?" he asked as they sat on her porch, the summer twilight stretching long shadows across her small yard. Katherine hesitated, then wrote, "Do you ever wish I could speak?" Blake considered the question carefully before answering. "Sometimes I wonder what your voice would sound like," he admitted. "But no, I don't wish you were different. Your silence is part of who you are, and who you are is who I've come to care for. But wouldn't it be easier if I could speak? For you, for us?" "Easier isn't always better," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe because you can't speak, I've learned to listen differently, not just to words, but to what's behind them." He reached for her hand. "Why are you asking this now?" Katherine hesitated, then wrote about what she'd overheard. Blake's expression darkened as he read. "People can be cruel out of ignorance," he said, anger evident in his voice. "But their opinions don't matter, only ours do." "But what about children?" Katherine wrote, voicing her deepest fear. "How could I be a mother, unable to call out warnings or comfort with words?" "The same way you do everything else," Blake replied without hesitation, "with determination and adaptability." His expression softened. "Katherine, I've seen mothers who can speak just fine but never say anything worth hearing to their children. Your love would speak volumes, voice or no voice." His confidence moved her deeply, but doubts still lingered. "You say that now, but what about years from now? What if you grow tired of my silence, of the difficulties it creates?" Blake was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he squeezed her hand gently. "I can't promise I'll never be frustrated or impatient. I'm human. But I can promise that I will never regret choosing you, silence and all." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I love you, Katherine Turner, not in spite of your silence, not because of it. Simply because you're you." The declaration, so simply stated yet so profound, brought tears to Katherine's eyes. She pulled her hand free to write, "I love you too." Blake's smile was radiant. "Then that's all that matters." The following Sunday, Blake escorted Katherine to church, as had become their custom. After the service, they walked toward Mrs. Chen's for the midday meal they often shared there. Their path took them past the saloon, unusually busy for a Sunday, with men spilling out onto the boardwalk. As they approached, Katherine recognized one of the men as Daniel Hoffman, a ranch hand known for his mean temper when drinking. He'd made disparaging remarks about her on several occasions. "Well, look here," Hoffman called out, his words slurred. "It's the Marshal and his mute woman. Tell us, Marshal, does she make any noise at all? Or is she silent as a grave even when you're—" He didn't finish the crude question. Blake moved so quickly Katherine barely saw at one moment he was beside her. The next he had Hoffman pinned against the saloon wall, forearm pressed against the man's throat. "Apologize to the lady," Blake said, his voice deadly quiet. Hoffman's eyes bulged, partly from the pressure on his throat, partly from surprise. Just funning," he choked out. "I don't find it amusing," Blake pressed harder. "And neither does Miss Turner. Apologize now." "Sorry," Hoffman gasped. "Didn't mean nothing by it." Blake released him with a disgusted shove. "If I ever hear you speak about Miss Turner that way again, you won't get off so lightly." "Understand," Hoffman nodded, rubbing his throat and glaring, but wise enough not to say more. Blake returned to Katherine's side, his face still tight with anger. "I apologize for that display," he said quietly as they continued walking. "Lost my temper." Katherine shook her head, touching his arm gently. When they were far enough away from onlookers, she wrote, "No one has ever defended me like that before." "Get used to it," Blake said, his expression softening as he looked at her. "I'll always stand up for you, Katherine. Always." 2 days later, Blake received a telegram that required him to travel to the territorial capital to testify at the outlaw's trial. "I'll be gone at least 2 weeks," he told Katherine that evening as they sat on her porch. "Maybe longer if there are delays." Katherine nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. She'd known this was coming, but that didn't make his imminent departure any easier. "I've been thinking," Blake continued, seeming unusually nervous, "about us, about the future." Catherine's heart skipped a beat. Was this leading where she hoped it might? I had planned to wait until after the trial, do this properly, he said, reaching into his pocket. But the thought of leaving without making my intentions clear. He produced a small box, opening it to reveal a simple gold ring set with a modest diamond. I know this is sudden. We've known each other barely 3 months, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Katherine stared at the ring, then at Blake's face, her eyes wide with surprise and hope. "Katherine Turner," Blake said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes, "I love you. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" For one wild moment, Katherine wished desperately that she could speak, could say the word yes aloud. But then she saw in Blake's eyes that her answer was already clear in her expression, in the tears of joy tracking down her cheeks. Still, she reached for her notepad, wanting to give him her answer in the most definite terms possible. But before she could write a word, Blake gently took the pencil from her hand. "You don't need to write it," he said softly. "I can see it in your eyes." Katherine nodded emphatically, then threw her arms around his neck. Blake held her close, his arms strong and secure around her waist. When they finally drew apart, Blake slipped the ring onto her finger. "It was my grandmother's," he explained. "My mother sent it when I wrote to her about you." Katherine examined the ring, then looked up at him questioningly. "Yes, I wrote to my family about you," Blake confirmed with a smile. "Told them I'd met the most remarkable woman in Whispering Creek. A woman of uncommon courage and kindness, who speaks more eloquently with her eyes and her written words than most people do with hours of talking." Katherine blushed at the praise, but her smile was radiant. She pulled out her notepad. "When should we marry?" "That depends," Blake said. "I need to return to the capital after the trial to report to my superiors. I was thinking, if you're willing, you could come with me. We could marry there, then travel to Texas to meet my family before deciding where to settle." Katherine considered this. Leaving Whispering Creek would mean giving up her aunt's house, the first place that had felt like her own. But it would also mean leaving behind the whispers and stares, starting fresh in a place where she and Blake could build their life together. "Yes," she wrote decisively. "I would like that very much." The news of their engagement spread quickly through Whispering Creek. Mrs. Chen was delighted, insisting on hosting a small celebration dinner the night before Blake's departure. Sheriff and Mrs. Miller attended along with the mayor and his wife, and a few others who had shown Katherine kindness during her time in town. "To Blake and Katherine," Sheriff Miller toasted, raising his glass. "Proof that sometimes the best things in life come in unexpected packages." The following morning, Katherine accompanied Blake to the stagecoach stop. Their parting was bittersweet, the pain of separation tempered by the promise of their future together. 2 weeks, Blake reminded her, holding both her hands in his. 3 at the most. "Then I'll be back for you and we'll start our life together." Katherine nodded, tears threatening despite her determination to see him off with a smile. She handed him an envelope, a letter she'd stayed up late writing, to be read on his journey. "I'll treasure it," he promised, tucking it carefully inside his coat. Then he kissed her, a lingering kiss that conveyed all the love and promise between them, heedless of the onlookers at the stage stop. As the stagecoach pulled away, Katherine stood watching until it disappeared from sight, her hand raised in farewell. Then she turned and walked back toward Mrs. Chen's laundry, her steps purposeful. She had 2 weeks to prepare for her new life, arrangements to make, possessions to sort, a house to sell. The first week of Blake's absence passed quickly, filled with practical tasks. Katherine negotiated the sale of her aunt's house to a young couple newly arrived in town, wrote to her few remaining acquaintances back east to inform them of her marriage plans, and began packing her belongings. Mrs. Chen proved an invaluable help, offering advice on what to take and what to leave behind. "Start new life, take only what matters," she counseled. "Memories here," she tapped Katherine's heart, "not in things." It was during the second week that trouble arrived in Whispering Creek. A band of drifters rode into town one afternoon, 5 rough-looking men who headed straight for the saloon. By evening, word had spread that they were asking questions about the bank's security, and the sheriff's patrol schedule information no honest men would need. Sheriff Miller posted deputies at the bank that night, but the men made no move. Instead, they remained in the saloon, drinking heavily and growing increasingly rowdy. Shortly after midnight, a fight broke out that spilled into the street, resulting in a local cowboy being badly beaten. The next morning, Katherine arrived at the laundry to find Mrs. Chen in an unusual state of agitation. "Those men," she said without preamble, "bad men. One come here asking about you." Katherine's blood ran cold. "About me," she wrote. "Why, ask if you Marshal's woman. Say he here talk in saloon." Mrs. Chen's expression was grave. "I say I not know any Marshal, but he not believe." Katherine felt a chill of foreboding. Could these men be connected to the outlaws Blake had helped capture, seeking revenge against those who had apprehended their comrades? "You stay here today," Mrs. Chen insisted. "Not go home alone. Sheriff Miller coming at noon. I send boy to tell him." Katherine nodded gratefully, though anxiety knotted her stomach. If these men were indeed seeking revenge against Blake, they might see her as a way to hurt him. Sheriff Miller arrived as promised, his usually jovial face serious. "Mrs. Chen sent word you might be in danger," he said without preamble. "These men been asking about Blake's whereabouts and now about you." Katherine wrote quickly, "Could they be connected to the Silverdale gang?" "That's my thinking," the sheriff confirmed. "3 more of that gang still at large. These could be them or friends coming to settle scores." "What should I do?" Katherine wrote, trying to keep her hand steady. "Stay in public places. Don't go home alone. In fact, might be best if you stayed with someone until Blake returns." He thought for a moment. "Mrs. Miller would be happy to have you." Katherine expressed her thanks for the offer, but wrote that she would stay with Mrs. Chen, who had already offered her the small room behind the laundry. The sheriff nodded approval of this plan. "I've sent a telegram to the marshal's office in the capital warning Blake," he added, "should reach him by tomorrow." The next 3 days passed in tense vigilance. Katherine remained at the laundry, working alongside Mrs. Chen and sleeping in the back room. Sheriff Miller increased patrols past both buildings, but the drifters made no overt moves. They continued to frequent the saloon, occasionally riding out of town for hours at a time, then returning. On the 4th day, Katherine was hanging laundry in the yard behind Mrs. Chen's when she heard a horse approach. Looking up, she saw one of the drifters, a tall man with a jagged scar across his left cheek, sitting astride a dun gelding just beyond the fence. "You the Marshal's woman?" He called, his voice carrying easily across the yard. Katherine froze, the wet sheet in her hands dripping onto her shoes. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway behind her, a shotgun in her small hands. "You go," the older woman ordered, raising the weapon. "Private property." The man laughed, seemingly unconcerned by the shotgun. "Just being neighborly, madam. Heard the Marshal's woman was a mute, curious to see for myself." His eyes fixed on Katherine with unsettling intensity. "Reckon it's true since she ain't denied it." "Sheriff coming," Mrs. Chen warned. "You go now." The man tipped his hat mockingly. "Another time, then." He wheeled his horse and rode unhurriedly away. Katherine's hands trembled as she finished hanging the sheet. The man's visit confirmed her fears. These men were indeed interested in her connection to Blake. That evening, Sheriff Miller brought unexpected news. "Got a telegram from Blake," he said, handing the paper to Katherine. "He's on his way back. Trial ended early when the defendants changed their pleas. He should be here day after tomorrow." Katherine felt a rush of relief, quickly followed by renewed anxiety. If Blake returned while these men were still in town, he could be riding into danger. She wrote this concern to the sheriff. "I've thought of that," Miller admitted. "Sent a deputy to intercept the stage at Ridgeline, warn Blake of the situation. He's not a man to be taken by surprise." The next day passed with excruciating slowness. The drifters were more visible in town, riding up and down the main street as if patrolling, watching the stagecoach stop with obvious interest. Their intent seemed clear. They were waiting for Blake's return. By evening, tension in Whispering Creek had reached a breaking point. Sheriff Miller deputized several townsmen, posting them strategically around town. He urged Katherine to remain indoors, out of sight. Blake's stage is due at noon tomorrow, he told her. My guess is these men will make their move then, thinking to catch him tired from travel. We'll be ready. But the drifters had other plans. Shortly after midnight, Katherine was awakened by shouts and the crack of gunfire. She rushed to the window of her small room to see flames leaping from a building down the street, the sheriff's office. Mrs. Chen appeared at her door, fully dressed despite the hour. Fire is distraction, she said grimly. They come for you. Quick, we go out back way. Katherine hastily pulled on her dress and shoes, grabbing only her notepad and the small bag containing her most precious possessions, Blake's letters, her parents' photographs, and the book of poetry he had given her. They slipped out through the laundry's back door into the dark yard. The town's attention was focused on the burning building, men forming a bucket brigade while women and children watched from a safe distance. No one noticed two women hurrying in the opposite direction. Mrs. Chen led Katherine to a small shed behind the blacksmith shop. You stay, she instructed. I find Sheriff Miller, tell him where you are. Do not come out, no matter what you hear. Katherine nodded, her heart pounding as Mrs. Chen disappeared into the darkness. The shed was little more than a storage space, filled with discarded horseshoes and broken wagon parts, but it offered concealment. Time crawled by. The shouting from the direction of the fire gradually diminished as the flames were brought under control. Katherine strained to hear any sound that might indicate Mrs. Chen's return, or worse, that the drifters had discovered her hiding place. A soft scratching at the door made her press back against the wall, heart thundering in her chest. Then came a whispered, Katherine, it's James Miller. Relief flooded through her as she opened the door to admit the sheriff. His face was streaked with soot, and he smelled strongly of smoke. They torched my office as a diversion, he explained tersely. Then went straight to Mrs. Chen's looking for you. Lucky she got you out when she did. He glanced over his shoulder into the darkness. We need to move you somewhere safer. They're searching the town. Where's Mrs. Chen? Katherine wrote hastily. Safe at my house with Mrs. Miller. Come on, we don't have much time. They slipped from the shed, keeping to the shadows between buildings. The sheriff led her toward the church at the end of the main street, its white steeple visible in the moonlight. Pastor's got a cellar, Miller explained in a hushed voice. Used to be part of the Underground Railroad before the war. Good hiding place. They had just reached the churchyard when a voice called from behind them. That's far enough, Sheriff. Miller spun around, pushing Katherine behind him. The scarred drifter stood at the gate, a revolver pointed steadily at them. Two more men emerged from the shadows, similarly armed. Just want the girl, the scarred man said. No need for more trouble. You've caused enough already, Miller replied, his hand hovering near his own weapon. Fire at the jail, terrorizing innocent women. For what? Thornton took something of ours. Only fair we take something of his. The man's cold eyes fixed on Katherine. Here, tell he's sweet on the mute girl. Figure she'll make good leverage. Katherine felt a chill at his words. They didn't just want to hurt her, they wanted to use her to control Blake. You won't get far, Miller warned. Marshal Thornton's due back tomorrow with a federal escort. This town's crawling with deputies. You boys are outnumbered. The scarred man laughed. Maybe so. But we only need to get far enough. Girl comes with us now, nobody else gets hurt. You can tell Thornton where to find us old mining camp up in Carson Ridge. Katherine saw the sheriff calculating their odds, 3 armed men against just him, with her to protect. She knew he couldn't risk a shootout with her in the middle, but before either could move, a new voice cut through the tense standoff. Drop your weapons, all of you. Blake Thornton stepped into view from around the side of the church, his rifle aimed steadily at the scarred man. He looked trail-worn and dusty, but his eyes were alert and hard as steel. The drifters hesitated, caught off guard by his unexpected appearance. You're supposed to be a day away, the scarred man snarled. Changed my plans, Blake replied coolly. Now drop those guns or I start shooting. For a tense moment, Katherine thought the men would risk a firefight. Then, with a curse, the scarred man lowered his weapon. His companions followed suit. On the ground, face down, Blake ordered. Sheriff, if you do the honors. As Miller moved to disarm and restrain the men, Blake's eyes met Katherine's. The relief and love she saw there made her heart swell. She wanted to run to him, but knew better than to distract him until the danger was fully contained. Only when the three drifters were securely bound did Blake lower his rifle. "The other two?" he asked Miller. "Deputies caught them trying to steal horses," the sheriff replied. "All 5 accounted for." Blake nodded, then finally turned his full attention to Katherine. In 2 quick strides he reached her, pulling her into a fierce embrace. "Are you hurt?" he murmured against her hair. She shook her head, clinging to him as the tension of the night drained away, leaving her trembling. "How did you know?" Sheriff Miller asked as deputies arrived to take charge of the prisoners. "Thought you weren't due till noon tomorrow." "Got your warning at Ridgeline," Blake explained, keeping one arm firmly around Katherine's waist. "Hired a horse, rode through the night. Good thing I did." He looked down at Katherine, his expression a mix of relief and lingering concern. "When I saw the smoke from the fire, I feared the worst." Katherine pulled away just enough to retrieve her notepad. "Mrs. Chen got me out in time. She saved me." "Remind me to thank her properly," Blake said fervently. "And Sheriff Miller." As dawn broke over Whispering Creek, the full story emerged. The 5 men were indeed connected to the Silverdale gang, not members themselves, but friends of the captured outlaws. They had planned to abduct Katherine and force Blake to help free their comrades from territorial prison. "Fool's errand," Blake commented as he and Katherine sat in Mrs. Miller's kitchen, cups of strong coffee before them. "As if I could or would arrange a prison break even for." He trailed off, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Even for you." Katherine squeezed his hand, understanding completely. Blake was a man of principle, a lawman to his core. She would never want him to compromise that, even for her sake. "What happens now?" she wrote. "The 5 of them will join their friends in territorial prison," Blake replied. "As for us," he smiled, the weariness in his face giving way to something warmer. "I believe we have a wedding to plan." News of the night's events spread quickly through Whispering Creek. By mid-morning, it seemed the entire town had heard how Blake had ridden through the night to save Katherine, how Mrs. Chen had outwitted the outlaws, how Sheriff Miller had protected the mute girl at risk to himself. But something had changed in how people referred to Katherine. No longer was she the mute girl or that strange Turner woman. Now she was Miss Katherine, or the Marshal's fiancée, defined not by what she lacked but by who she was and who loved her. The change was most evident 3 days later at the small gathering in the church to witness Blake and Katherine's wedding. With the outlaws safely imprisoned and no reason to delay, they had decided to marry in Whispering Creek before traveling to meet Blake's family. The church was filled to capacity. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Sheriff and Mrs. Miller were there, along with the mayor and his wife. Even Mr. Simmons from the general store and his gossip-prone wife had come, bringing a wedding gift of fine china. Katherine wore a dress of cream-colored silk that Mrs. Miller had helped her alter from her Sunday best. Her copper hair was arranged with white rosebuds from Mrs. Hammond's garden. But her finest ornament was her smile, radiant and unguarded as she walked down the aisle to where Blake waited. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. When Pastor Thomas asked if Katherine took Blake to be her husband, she nodded firmly, then surprised everyone by mouthing the words "I do" silent but unmistakable. Blake's voice was steady as he spoke his vows, his eyes never leaving hers. "I promise to be your voice when you need one, your strength when you falter, your companion in joy and in sorrow. I promise to listen not just with my ears but with my heart, to cherish your written words as others cherish spoken ones. With this ring I thee wed." As he slipped the gold band onto her finger to join her engagement ring, Katherine felt a fullness in her heart that nearly overwhelmed her. This man, this good, brave, patient man had seen beyond her silence to the woman beneath, had defended her, protected her, and loved her completely. "By the power vested in me," Pastor Thomas concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Blake's kiss was gentle yet filled with promise, a pledge of all the years to come. When they turned to face their friends, the applause was thunderous. A community that had once whispered about the mute girl now cheering for Katherine Thornton and her new husband. The celebration afterward at Mrs. Chen's was joyous. Someone brought a fiddle, another a harmonica. There was dancing and laughter, food and drink. Through it all, Blake remained at Catherine's side, her notepad always within reach, though she found she needed it less among people who had learned to read her expressions and gestures. As evening fell, they said their goodbyes. They would leave for Texas in the morning to meet Blake's family before he reported back to his superiors to determine his next assignment. "You'll come back and visit?" Mrs. Chen asked as she hugged Catherine fiercely. "Not forget old Mrs. Chen." Catherine shook her head emphatically, writing, "Never. You are family now." Their last stop was at Sheriff Miller's house to thank him once more for his protection. "You're a lucky man, Blake," the sheriff said as they stood on his porch. Not many women would have the courage Catherine showed that night. "Don't I know it?" Blake agreed, his arm around his wife's waist. "I'm thankful every day that I stopped in Whispering Creek." Later, alone in Catherine's now their small house for the last time, Blake held her close in the darkness. "Happy, Mrs. Thornton," he murmured against her hair. Catherine nodded, then pulled away to light the lamp beside the bed. In the warm glow, she took her notepad and wrote words she had been saving for this moment. "I never thought I would find someone who would understand me as you do. Who would see my silence not as a flaw but simply as part of me. You gave me a voice when others only heard silence." Blake read her words, his expression softening. "And you gave me something I didn't even know I was missing," he replied. "A reason to stop wandering, a home that isn't a place but a person." He drew her close again, his kiss deeper this time, filled with the promise of their wedding night and all the nights to come. As Catherine surrendered to his embrace, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, wherever Blake's duties might take them, they would face them together, their love a language that needed no words. 5 years later, Blake and Katherine Thornton returned to Whispering Creek. Much had changed in the small frontier town. New buildings lined the main street. The general store had expanded, and a proper schoolhouse had replaced the one-room structure where they had attended their first social together. But the greatest changes were in the couple themselves. Blake no longer wore a marshal's badge, having accepted a position as head of security for the Western Union Telegraph Company, a job that allowed him to use his tracking and protective skills while maintaining a more stable home life. And Catherine, walking beside him with a copper-haired 3-year-old boy balanced on her hip and leading a 5-year-old girl by the hand, carried herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who had found her place in the world. They had come back for Mrs. Chen's 70th birthday celebration, bringing their children to meet the woman Catherine still considered family. They would stay for 2 weeks, catching up with old friends and showing their children the town where their parents' love story began. As they walked down the familiar street, Blake squeezed Catherine's free hand. "Still think coming to Whispering Creek was the best wrong turn I ever took," he said with a smile. Catherine returned the pressure, her heart full. That long-ago summer day when she had stepped off the stagecoach, alone and afraid, seemed like another lifetime. She had arrived voiceless and been met with mockery and misunderstanding. She was returning now, still without speech but surrounded by love, understood and accepting of who she was. At Mrs. Chen's door, Blake paused, looking down at their daughter. "Remember what we told you about Mrs. Chen? She's very special to your mama and me." The little girl nodded solemnly. "She helped Mama when she was scared and she shoots a shotgun." Blake laughed. "That's right, though let's not lead with that part." As Mrs. Chen opened the door, her face lighting up at the sight of them, Catherine felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest. This place, this town that had once seemed so hostile, had become part of her story, the beginning of the journey that had led to everything she now cherished. She might never find her speaking voice, but she had found something far more precious, a life filled with love, understanding, and acceptance. A husband who saw her silence not as an absence but simply as part of who she was. Children who were growing up knowing that communication took many forms, that listening could be as important as speaking. And it had all begun here in Whispering Creek, where a silent girl had been mocked, and a cowboy had sat with her until she found her words.